Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome Dr. Anu Chawla. She is the Associate Specialist, Center for Reproductive Medicine, St. Bartholomew's Hospital, London. Today, she is going to talk about stimulating the PCOS patient. It is one of the most interesting and challenging case scenarios for any IVF consultant. So, over to you, Dr. Anu.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rishikesh, for inviting me, Dr. Rishma Pai, Dr. Nandita Palshedkar, Dr. Zeev Shoham, Dr. Milton, and Mumbai Society, for which actually I'm a life member, and IVF Worldwide. Thank you, lovely Sheetal, for a very lovely introduction. So I'll start my presentation now. The topic for my presentation today is PCOS, ovarian induction and stimulation. There are no disclosures to make. The learning objectives are to understand the key concepts and practical nuances involved in the journey of women with PCOS through IVF. So we've had a very extensive journey because it started in 1990 when in the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, it started where the first meeting was done under leadership of many prominent figures like Dr. Bart Foser, many other leaders who have done extensive work. And now we are here in 2018 with this Bible of ESHRE guidelines, which is actually a very fantastic manuscript produced after extensive research and with people who have worked extensively in the subject. It is a perplexing topic and found very widespread, and hence has caught the eye of many researchers. It is a misnomer. We know it is not polycystic. So the name needs a revision, and several attempts have been made since 2012 with no success. Polyfollicular ovarian syndrome or other names could be more appropriately describing the situation. The incidence, some of the literature actually says it is up to as high as 1 in 5 even. So in this presentation, we are covering fairly narrow aspect of the subject because it covers hugely varied wide departments in medicines like these. So the Bible of this manuscript given by the team led by Dr. Helena Teed has given us very important guidelines. And I have just summarized here in this slide that what are they actually saying? So if we summarize the whole treatment in one slide, so the first line is ovulogens. There is a fight between letrozole and CC, we'll come to that. Then when do we add metformin in that? When do we add gonadotrophins in the treatment, and when do we switch over to the third line actually, which is IVF? So this is called as the third line, although it is a direct indicator. Coming to diagnosis, very important. It's actually diagnosis of PCOS itself can be a whole presentation because it starts with a very important safety aspect that we shouldn't be considering any hyperandrogenic oligomenoric women to be having PCOS. So we have to first of all rule out any sinister cause that can cause such a clinical situation. A very simple thing to do this is just to see the total testosterone. 2 to 5 millimoles is parallel to the PCOS diagnosis. Anything more than 5 can be sinister, and then we must check for 17-OHP and other applicable markers. To see for the androgen elevation, the 3 most important things are free testosterone, free androgen index, which we know is total testosterone with respect to the SHBG level and percentage of that, and the calculated, which is a lab recommended calculated bioavailable testosterone. If at all they are all normal and we still have a high index of suspicion, then we do the other 2 hormones, which are androstenedione and DHEA. So we must make sure that the women who are taking OC pills might be giving incorrect results. So androgen elevation cannot be calculated due to the side effect, due to the effects made on the SHBG in these women and altered gonadotrophin dependent androgen production. When it comes to ultrasound, 3D ultrasound is important. It is important to note that this guideline has told us that 3D ultrasound shouldn't be used to diagnose up to 8 years after post-menarche, because in these young adolescents, we anyway see multicystic ovaries. And obviously, due to better probes, the threshold is made higher now, up to 20. Coming to this very important figure, so this was a study done in Netherlands under the guidance of Professor Bart Fosser in his group, in which they showed that the yellow, green, and the blue, so nearly 50% of patients with a phenotype going parallel with PCO are having androgen elevation, but nearly 50%, which is red, they do not have the androgen elevation. So such women do have the ovarian dysfunction with the polycystic ovarian morphology, but they do not have the hyperandrogenemia, and they make almost 50% of. So here we see basically how varied are the phenotypes. Coming to lifestyle, Cochrane database in 2019 has reviewed and concluded that there are no studies actually which tell us that actually correcting the lifestyle makes any difference on live birth, miscarriage, or regularity of menstrual cycles. But not having data does not mean that we don't follow what is logical. So it may result in weight loss or reduction in the elevated androgen levels in some individuals. Very important question is that when we have an established case of PCOS, in that case, will you offer this patient a tubal test when you know PCOS might be the clear reason? So do you do the patency test in such a patient, or you don't do? So there is a recommendation in the guideline which says that where there is a suspected tubal infertility, in those cases, we tell the patients about the risk, benefits, cost, and timing, and then we offer the tubal patency testing. Very important is how do you predict ovulation in an anovulatory PCO women? This is again a very beautiful study done by one of the PhD students of Professor Bart Fosser, Babik Imani. So he actually did this paper, and what we came out with this study is that there were 4 initial parameters which so the combination of these showed a good predictive power with the ROC area under the curve as 0.82. So that means that with these 4 parameters, we can actually predict whether this woman will ovulate with CC or not. And they are the free androgen index and BMI and mean ovarian volume and the cycle history. LH, we usually think that high LH will have some relevance to the prediction, but this study showed that LH increased or not increased had a 50% chance each. So basically, it did not have any predictive value. Elevated androgen levels. So women with these, in this category, they had the greater chance of remaining anovulatory, and so it is predicted that someone who has a higher androgen level might not ovulate with the clomiphene. So what are the principles of ovulation induction? Let's see what's the fight between letrozole versus CC. So the first warning given in the guideline is that basically some of these drugs might be off-label in different countries. For example, letrozole is off-label here in UK, and pregnancy should be excluded in the oligomenoric, amenorrheic women before we give them ovulogens, and a prolonged use should be avoided. Now, which one to give? So letrozole is considered as a first line according to this guideline, but we'll come to the depth of it now. This is the highest quality of study that can be done, which is an individual participant data meta-analysis. So what we do not combine the conclusions of the studies. What we do is we ask them to give us their data. In each study, we combine only the data and we reanalyze. So this is a very powerful way to study something. So this also actually favored letrozole, but the downside is only 3 studies were included. But the odds ratio was 1.4 in favor of letrozole for the live birth rate and the clinical pregnancy rate. So it improved the live birth rate. Now, very important point here is that letrozole, the effects of letrozole are influenced by the baseline serum level of the testosterone, while those of the clomiphene with metformin group, they are affected by the baseline level of insulin. So maybe it's a clinical nuance to just see if a hyperandrogenic woman would be more suitable for letrozole, and a hyperinsulinemic woman might be more suitable for the CC plus metformin approach. And this can be a personalized approach. We have this trial. I am, to be honest, not aware to what level of the data is still out, but we have this trial which will give us the eventual answer to this question. We also have
sorry
this.
Sorry to interrupt. 10 minutes up.
Okay, so aromatase inhibitors versus for subfertile women in PCOS, Cochrane database of 2014 said in favor of letrozole. That means live birth and pregnancy rates are better with that, but the quality of this evidence was low, and they updated and they only added the good quality trials out of that in 2018. And then they said that there is a high quality of evidence that OHSS rates are similar with letrozole or clomiphene. And also there's a high quality of evidence of no difference in miscarriage rate. So CC becomes as important. Drilling. In February 2020, we have the Cochrane review, which says it may decrease, but they also highlight for this point that the estimate is having a very limited power to the first point that they've concluded. The other thing is that it probably reduces the multiple pregnancy, and there is an uncertainty about the effect on the miscarriage when you compare the drilling with the ovulogens. Also, it may result in the less hyperstimulation. The quality of evidence is insufficient when we look into the various parameters for unilateral versus the bilateral drilling. The guideline says it is the second line, but it is the first line when there is another reason to do the surgery. So gonadotrophins with the perspective of induction is actually the second line, but when there is a commitment from the patient to come and considering the cost and availability, it can be first line in presence of ultrasound monitoring. And where available, it should be used in preference of clomiphene is the guideline actually, which is evidence-based and which is a very highly powered point here to improve ovulation, pregnancy, and live birth rate. Coming to the third line now. So the outline is that it is a direct indicator of IVF, and we do not really need to always do the first and the second line therapy. And depending on an individual couple, we take the decision. Which drug? There's a US-based trial, Megaset, which says that no difference between REC-FSH and the HMG. Segmentation approach is important in this group of patients. IVM is still experimental. There's another reason to do IVF in PCOS women because sometimes we have to work on their endometrium, and we can control the multiple pregnancy by doing IVF, by doing the elective single transfer. How about the pre-IVF treatment? If we look into the OC pills, the downsides are it increases, so all these are evidence-based, but the conclusion is it increases the overall consumption of gonadotrophins. The pregnancy rate is decreased. The length of the stimulation is increased. The dose of the gonadotropin needed is higher. And there are lower number of oocytes. The good point is actually this concept has been proven by the group of Sherman Silber. And they believe that it works better because it does the weeding out and kills off the non-atretic, the atretic poor quality pre-antral oocytes, and also prevents the OHSS. And also it gives us the coordinated cohort. Combination of pre-IVF OC pills with agonist trigger. I just want to highlight this point here. For those women who are taking OC pills and later we're giving them agonist trigger during the treatment, this happens very commonly for donors. So this agonistic trigger requires a good level of endogenous LH, which is actually decreased already by the OC pill. And hence, it's not a good combination. So it might actually compromise our harvest. How about AMH? So inherently, it is a inhibitory or hormone. It suppresses the femaleness. And it is actually the indirect indicator of the number of follicles which are kept suppressed. And this is how we understood the hormone. It is not yet to be used to diagnose PCOS because we do not have an absolute cutoff. The guideline is saying IVF is a third line, and it works because the multiple pregnancies can be minimized. Hyperstimulation is indeed the risk, and urinary or recombinant work equally well, and recombinant LH should not be routinely used. What is the place of metformin? We have this Cochrane library database from 2014, which says there is no conclusive evidence when it comes to live birth, but there is increased clinical pregnancy rate and the decreased risk of OHSS. And hence the guideline has said that it could be used to improve the clinical pregnancy rate and decrease the OHSS. Which protocol to use for these patients? These guidelines have clearly favored the use of antagonist protocol. Of course, the place for agonist trigger and elective freezing in case of hyperstimulated patients has a place. So when they did the guideline, they reviewed 8 studies, and there was a statistically significant difference when it comes to 3 parameters. So the amount of gonadotropin was reduced, duration reduced, and the hyperstimulation reduced when antagonist was used. But either of the protocol had no statistically significant difference when it comes to the pregnancy rate, miscarriage, oocytes collected, cancellation rate, or the multiple pregnancy. Which drug to use? So this is, like we've already pointed, this is a trial done in US, and it just said that HMG works well because we do not anyway want too many oocytes. More than 15 had a negative impact, and those supernumerary oocytes did not confer a cumulative better live birth rate. So the choice of drugs should not be, this is the guideline review, so it should be dependent more on the availability, convenience, and cost. We know that segmentation works very well. Choosing an antagonist protocol, choosing an agonist trigger. We have kisspeptin these days, which acts even on a higher level, hypothalamus, works similar to agonist, but it's still not in practice widely. And also third is the vitrification. So this combination makes the whole profile very safe. Trigger, like I already pointed, we have the agonist trigger, kisspeptin. Dual trigger has a place more in the poor responders, but also here when we are repeatedly getting immature eggs. So this is a outline of what Eshrey is saying about how to do the overall treatment. I think we've covered all these points. So moving to IVM, which is still in the experimental stage, only to be done in units with sufficient expertise. What are the complications specific to PCOS? OHSS, multiple pregnancy, and those women with hyperandrogenemia might find it difficult to maintain pregnancy. How do we predict? So out of the whole literature, the most powerful predictor for OHSS is actually mentioned by Dr. Richard Legros and Nick Rainfenning, that this is actually the stromal abundance and the increased peak systolic velocity in the Doppler in the ovarian stroma, which is the very strong predictor that this woman will develop an OHSS. And other things are actually not very strong predictors. How do we prevent the OHSS? So the first point is based on the work done by Dr. Raj Mathur's team in Manchester and Dr. Sood. So they have said that we better fix the freezing protocol for the patient right in the beginning based on the ovarian reserve test, and not later when we see the hyperstimulation. This is the study that they've done. Starting dose, popularly more promoted these days, is 150 for most patients. Megaset trial has said HMG will reduce the OHSS, also giving equally good results. Antagonist protocol, kisspeptin, and intravenous calcium works for some patients, and metformin, of course. So what does not reduce the risk of OHSS is the REC LH, and all these other things that actually we do and use sometimes in some units. Probably they are not very helpful. This is a fantastic thing that is actually there with us now, September 2020 publication in Fertility Sterility. It is actually the national ART surveillance data of US from 2000 to 2015. And nearly just less than 2 million cases they reviewed, which made almost 97% of the total cycles done in this time. And what they found was that all this time, OHSs kept on decreasing and antagonists kept on increasing. There was a bit of spike earlier, which was basically the transition phase. So probably we had to look into other things, maybe training or what. So this eventually has this conclusion that any type or severe or moderate OHS or OHSs all decrease, but the only thing increased was the use of antagonist protocol. And this was the outcome, which we have already, it's just similar to the segmentation approach, and a target of 15 mature oocytes was promoted. How about the pregnancy? Now, this is a recent publication in April 2020, which is very smartly done actually, that they did this study to see that there is the ultimate, basically they said that if we are able to get a euploid embryo, then the difference between the pregnancy was not there. So a likely cause of pregnancy failure was actually aneuploidy. So once you have euploid blast, then the pregnancy rates between PCO and non-PCO patients are similar. This is again the NAS data, and we have the risk ratio of 1.29 for the low birth weight in those women who developed OHSS, and adjusted risk ratio of 1.32 in those patients who had OHSS and had a preterm delivery by a margin of 1 week. This is a study done to decide which protocol. So they chose only the non-obese patients so that obesity should not be a confounding factor. And they actually found that the embryological and the clinical outcome for both the protocols actually were similar. So in the data we have, these are the odds ratios and early pregnancy loss, pregnancy-induced hypertension, perinatal mortality, diabetes, preterm labor, small for gestational age, rate of cesarean section. All these things go higher in cases of PCO women. And how about multiple pregnancy? Most of the multiple pregnancies that we have.
Ma'am, sorry to interrupt. 22 minutes up.
All right. Okay, I'll just close now. So most of the multiple pregnancies that we have are due to IUI and not due to IVF. So the silver lining is basically we know now that the age of menopause in PCOS is later compared to the general population. We assume ovarian aging is less prominent in PCOS, and for those who are trying to get pregnant at later age, maybe they have higher chance to get pregnant. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anu, for this wonderful presentation. I'm sure it will help a lot of people about how to stimulate a PCOS patient. So Sagar, should I go with the question or like what?
Please continue with one question because we have only less time left. One question, one brief answer.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
So Dr. Anu, what is your experience or opinion about mild or minimal stimulation protocols in PCOS patient, especially if they have had bad oocytes in the previous stimulation? So have you done this in the past or like any experience about it?
So I have worked in a unit who are the pioneers of the mild stimulation, and I worked with them for quite a good length of time, and they do in that unit we do almost 3,000 patients in a year. For most of them are modified natural. But literature doesn't say that specifically when you talk about PCO women, it doesn't, mild stimulation doesn't have really been established based on the evidence.
Okay.
I would say it has a place in the poor responders,
Yes.
in the older women, because the concept is the biological efficiency of the egg, which is formed naturally, is better.
Yeah.
But the whole challenge in the PCO is there is no ovulation in most of these women, and when they ovulate, there's no unifollicular growth that we see. So because of that, IVF gives a better chance actually to give them a single pregnancy. So the role of minimal stimulation in PCO patients in evidence-based literature is not very strongly established as yet, but in different other groups it is.
Thank you.
Thank you.